At age 22, Dexter Manley could do a lot of things. He could throw a football really well. So well, in fact, that he was drafted into the NFL Redskins. However, despite the fact that Dexter could neither functionally read nor write, he remained eligible to play all 4 years at Oklahoma State University, effectively throwing out his education and essentially telling him that football was the only thing that mattered in life. Dexter Manley was not alone. Tons of student athletes are essentially told that their educations don't matter and that sports is the only thing in their life that should matter. That sets them up for failure because likely they're not going to play sports for the rest of their life. And when we're discussing the question today, should we pay student athletes, specifically college athletes, we're going to be looking at why this answer is going to be a resounding yes. First, we're going to talk about how definitionally they're employees, before moving on to how colleges and universities use them as cash cows, and then talking about why they absolutely deserve to be compensated for the work that they're doing. So let's talk about how employees deserve pay. California's recent pay-to-play bill essentially acknowledged that they were, in fact, employees. Essentially, what the pay-to-play bill does is it acknowledges that colleges and universities employ these student athletes and that they should be allowed to capitalize off of their names, their faces. They should be allowed to take deals. So, for example, if Adidas came up to a soccer player and said, hey, we want to make a deal with you, these college athletes would be able to do that. Under the current NCAA standards, they're not allowed to do that. Additionally, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, essentially what that established was the minimum wage. And since the California pay-to-play bill established that they are in fact employees, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, they would absolutely be considered employees who would at the very bare minimum deserve minimum wage. Now, the federal minimum wage is $7.25. However, it would depend on the state. So specifically in Colorado, for example, I believe it's something like $13 or $11 an hour. So student athletes in Colorado would get $11 or $13 an hour, and that would be again under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So as we can see, just under definitionally, California and other states now, such as Florida, who is considering passing a similar bill, are now acknowledging that these student athletes are in fact employees. And as we're going to see, because of this, they should absolutely be getting paid. Moving on to contention number 2, the fact that these students are being used as cash cows by their universities. Playing for peanuts, determining fair compensation for NCAA student athletes, examined how much money these student athletes are actually able to bring in. And while you might think that it might not be that much, it's a literal billion-dollar industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry, in fact. Approximately 350 universities fall under the Division I standard for the NCAA. And they have a yearly revenue just shy of $1 billion, and that's just the university revenue in general. Universities can generate $8 billion per year from their athletic program. 49 million fans attend NCAA athletic events every year, and 750 million more watch on television from the comforts of their own homes. These same fans show their support by purchasing collegiate merchandise, which has resulted in the college licensing market growing into a $4.6 billion industry. Again, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Even the coaches, USA Today on October 19th of 2019 found that the average salary of a D1 coach is $2.67 million, with 10 coaches making upwards of $6 million per year, and that's their salary. Essentially, right now, the only people who aren't able to profit off of college athletics are the athletes themselves. Basically, what these colleges and universities are doing are telling these students, number one, that their educations don't matter, which we'll get into in a little bit, but number two, they're using them as generating revenue for their universities, which again, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's a great thing that colleges and universities are able to make so much off of their athletic programs. But the issue lies in the fact that these college athletes are making literally nothing. And when we get into why their education is being devalued, we're going to see that scholarships aren't enough. So moving on to the third and the biggest contention, compensation. Josh Rosen, who was a former UCLA quarterback, said, quote, "Look, football and school don't go together. They just don't. Trying to do both is like trying to do 2 full-time jobs." I absolutely could not agree more, because when you look at the work that student athletes put into their sports, and then you look at how much a normal college student would do working a part-time job, you can see that students actually working, going to school, and doing sports is completely incompatible. And sure, schools might offer them some form of compensation in the form of scholarships, but really that's not enough, especially when college athletes specifically tend to spend more time doing things related to their sport than being in class. We can see that the NCAA doesn't value players as students, and they value them as athletes. They see them again as revenue generating devices. Business Insider tells us how athletes work upwards of 40 hours a week in season and can train as much as 50 to 60 hours during preseason or off season. So as we can see, it's during their full year. It's not just for a couple of months where they're unable to work. It's literally all year that these athletes are unable to get any other source of revenue because of their sport. And again, the NCAA study found that basketball and football players spend more time in sports-related activities than in class. Sports is literally detracting away from their education. And of these 73,000 D1 football players, only 1.5% will ever go on to play professionally. So we can see that when we're talking about them being paid, we can see that they should be compensated because of the fact that their education is literally being thrown away. They're being told that their education doesn't matter. The least that colleges and universities can do would be giving them money so that maybe they can go to a community college after they're unable to get into the NFL and get some sort of degree that's actually going to help them in life, because the classes that they're taking obviously won't. Shane Battier, who was a former Duke University basketball player who went on to play in the NBA, told a congressional committee that his professional sports schedule was less demanding than his college schedule. And that's really important, again, when we're talking about the amount of pressure that is put on these student athletes. And we look to the fact that these student athletes are literally being told that they can't work. They're literally being forced to not work. He goes on to say that, therefore, what athletes really receive in exchange for their efforts is merely the cost of tuition, not the value of an education. Student athletes are brought to universities more as performers than as aspiring undergraduates. And it is fair to ask whether the letters BA stand more for Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Athletics. Mm-hmm. And again, what we can see there is that student athletes themselves are saying, we're not going to school to be students, we're going to school to be athletes. Those two things in the world of college athletes are mutually exclusive, which is why we should absolutely be, at the very least, compensating them for all the work that they're pouring into their sport and all the revenue that they're generating for their colleges and universities. When we look as a whole into how college athletes are being treated, we can absolutely see that they deserve to be compensated. Number one, because they're unable to work any other jobs, but number two, because colleges obviously aren't valuing their education. So the least they can do is repay them back for the fact that they're not giving them any sort of education. In closing, Business Insider describes the NCAA as a multi-billion-dollar corporation that straight up refuses to pay its employees. And as we've looked at today, first we looked at the fact that they are, in fact, employees under a couple of definitions, and how states like California and Florida are already acknowledging this, saying that even if the universities don't pay them, they should be able to take deals with companies such as Gatorade or Adidas or any other companies that might approach them and ask for a deal. Before moving on to how these companies, or how these universities rather, even though they're sort of indistinguishable at this point, use them as cash cows, and how they generate literally billions of dollars in revenue for these universities, and even their coaches are making millions of dollars for their salaries, but the only people who aren't benefiting in any way, shape, or form, except for maybe the 1.5% who are going on to play professionally, are these college athletes. And then we wrapped up by talking about why they deserve compensation and why they're essentially being forced out of the classroom into these sports-related activities without any sort of compensation, and how their education is being thrown away. It's for all these reasons and many more that I strongly urge an AF ballot.